Welcome to War Games Untold, all of you lovely people. I am once again back talking about the latest edition of Warcry, and today I am talking about the beefiest of lads, blacksmiths to Archeon himself. Of course, I am talking about the burly Iron Golems. But before we get into all that, please consider supporting your local bakery and hitting the like, subscribe, and of course leaving a comment. It helps the channel out an awful lot and helps me get my content out to more new players for Warcry and helps grow the greater Warcry community. And in addition, it helps me fight against the dastardly YouTube algorithmic demon. But all that out of the way, let's get on with the show.
And now for something completely different.
So, who are the Iron Golems? Unmatched both in martial prowess and forgecraft, the Iron Golems are an immovable, unflinching wall of metal and death. Clad in iron and brandishing weapons capable of unholy destruction, they march forth into Gert to prove themselves to their less than benevolent masters. As always, we're going to start with the pros and the cons to whet your palate, to give you a bit of a scrumptious morsel of what is to come. And starting with the pros, the Iron Golems are a competitively viable first edition bespoke warband. Iron Golems are one of the most reliably successful warbands from first edition. Whilst they don't top the ranks, they certainly hold their own, unlike, say, the Tarantulas Brood or the Cypher Lords. To help with that, these guys have some truly outstanding models when it comes to point-for-point efficiency. Whether we're talking about the shockingly resilient Iron Legionnaires or the wonderfully reliable Armata, Iron Golems can field surprisingly large warbands for guys this effective in combat. And by effective, I mean effective. These guys have fantastic combat stats, whether that be their above average defensive stats across the board or wonderfully punchy offensive stats. These guys can take a hit and have plenty of ways to dish it right on back. They even have an in-faction ogre. Finally, these guys can be played either as a smashy kill force or a resilient control faction. They do both wonderfully, allowing you to get the Iron Golems to fit into just about any meta. Now, unfortunately, there are some cons to the Iron Golems that do hold them back slightly. Firstly, their warband box is actually awful. You don't get anywhere near enough of the things you actually want, or more accurately, need. You need to buy 2 to 3 boxes to get anywhere with them, or you're going to have to buy specific models from single model retailers or eBay. It makes them surprisingly hard to start, and whilst their box is fine on its own, you'll want to branch out sooner or later. It's also not very cost efficient, making it quite expensive to get something going. Now, in terms of mechanics, the Iron Golems are seriously on the underwhelming side of meh when it comes to abilities. You'll almost certainly be saving your dice for onslaught in most cases, or to fuel your allies, a thing that Iron Golems love to dabble with. Iron Golems also lack dedicated ranged units. Whilst they do have access to a surprising amount of range 3 melee weapons, you'll often skip over these for more efficient options within the warband. You also have an ability for some added ranged attack, but again, these resources are better spent elsewhere. Finally, the Iron Golems are fairly slow. They run the gamut and have guys at 3 inches, 4 inches, and 5 inches, although you'll almost certainly be stocked up on the lower end of that scale. They also have no in-faction mobility tricks in their arsenal at all, which makes them feel a little bit plodding, a little bit trudgely. Thankfully, there are some ways to get around this, and we'll look into them later on. Moving on, we are going to look at the Iron Golems' reactions and their one universally accessible ability. We will, as always, start with their reaction, and it's called Clashing Iron. This reaction is very powerful and works perfectly with Iron Golems and their general tanky playstyle. This thing allows you to convert 2 critical hits into regular hits when attacked in melee combat, and this can be massive for your survivability. The bigger the gap between hit and crit damage, the better this ability becomes. How many times has a sneaky spear-wielding chaff mob like an Ungor clocked you for 4 damage on a sneaky crit? More times than you can count, I am sure. Not anymore though. You need to be clued in as to what damage each enemy can do and then react to negate as much of it as possible. In general, you'll be dancing between using Clashing Iron and Counter constantly, depending on the situation, since both work so well within this faction. All you have to do is move into position and wait. Your guys are tough, so you aren't going anywhere soon without some serious muscle being thrown your way, and spoiler, Clashing Iron makes that muscle far less effective. Now onto our first and only ability that every model in the faction can use. We have Throw Bolus, and it's bad. It's a ranged attack that has a pretty high chance of doing negligible damage. It's usable in a bind, as are all abilities that fall into this cheap ranged ability profile, but that's really it. In general, you should really save your dice for other things, mostly Onslaught or Rush, or again, your allies. With some gold and a little bit of guff out of the way, let's dive into their units and see what they're all about. We start with their leader, the mighty Dominar. This guy is fine. I actually like him an awful lot. He comes with above average wounds, an average movement, and average toughness. His offensive profile is pretty swell too, with 4 strength 5 attacks hitting for 2/5 damage. At only 170 points, he's a bit of a winner. I just wouldn't ever take more than one since his faction is where it's at. He's more there just to babysit them when all is said and done. Now he does come with 2 abilities, Spine Crushing Blow, which allows him to buff his strength for the rest of his activation, and Lead with Strength, which lets him make a bonus move or bonus attack action if he lands a kill. Spine Crushing Blow is very nice to have in a pinch, as it allows your Dominar to swing up at toughness 6 and above enemies with relative ease. Lead with Strength is more of a gamble, as the Dominar, whilst fine in combat, isn't a surefire killer even against fairly standard infantry. You are almost always better off running Onslaught here unless you see an opportunity to get some guaranteed value. Next up, we have the model that every newcomer will love and every foe will love to hate, the Ogre Breacher. This guy is a mountain of flesh that comes in at a very reasonable price. We are talking about a wall of iron who still retains movement 4 and rocks up with 30 wounds and toughness 5. His offense is where he really shines though, with 3 strength 6 for 8 damage attacks. All of this for only 220 points. What an absolute steal. This guy is 40 points cheaper than a Fomoroid Crusher and has the exact same offensive stats and only a slightly downgraded defensive line. This guy is so cheap you could feasibly run 2 of them and get some serious bashing going. The Breacher is your distraction Carnifex, your hammer, your tank destroyer. He's a little ball of death, and whilst you don't need him in Iron Golems, you are always happy to see him when your list, meta, or format allow him to take the field. An absolute chad of a unit. And let's not forget his unique triple, which actually might be the best ability the faction has access to in Living Battering Ram. This lets you deal ability dice damage after moving near an enemy. So long as your ability dice value is 4+, this is always worth using over Onslaught, since this is 100% guaranteed damage. Perfect for landing a chunky hit when moving or even double moving. Onto the Drill Master now, and honestly I find the Drill Master to be a really interesting and versatile character, just not one I find myself using all that often. In terms of stats, she is solid. Toughness 4 and 18 wounds is the standard for all of our elite infantry, and it's a good profile to have, if a smidge on the expensive side considering she is 140 points. That being said, she also comes with the highest movement in the warband at movement 5. This is complemented with her range 3 flail, which delivers a rather impressive 4 strength 4 2/3 damage attacks. The crit does let it down a little bit, but at range 3 there's a lot to like here. If you want even more damage, you can use her 1-inch range attack that is identical in terms of output and strength, but comes with 2-4 damage instead. She also has access to the Warband's only quad, Whirlwind of Death, which lets her deal ability dice damage to all enemies within 3 inches, providing they are visible. This is a very powerful AoE ability that is especially good against chaff-heavy armies like Soulblight Gravelords, but as a quad, you aren't always going to be able to use it. She's okay, but as you will soon find out as we continue to break down the units, we have more than a few that are better than okay, and they all overshadow her, sadly. The Prefector is another solid model. It is, in short, a weaker version of the Dominar. Movement 4, Toughness 4, and 18 wounds gives you the standard defensive profile of our beefy chaps, and then you throw in 4 attacks, Strength 4, 2-5 damage, and you're starting to stare down at a model that is pretty solid in combat. And for 135 points, it's not too bad. The Prefector also comes with Spine Crushing Blow, which allows it to push its strength all the way to 10 if you really wanted to, making him very reliable at swinging up. Like I said before, he is a mini Dominar, which is kind of cool. Again though, he falls a bit flat when you consider our other options, and don't worry, we're almost at those. Although we aren't just there yet, the Signifier is the alternative variant of the Prefector. This guy is 10 points cheaper, loses out on Crushing Blow, and loses 1 pip of crit damage. All of this is fine because I actually think the Signifier is almost worth taking in some lists where the Prefector never really makes his way in. This is because the Signifier is 1, fairly cheap, and 2, has a great ability called Stand Defiant. It's a triple that gives every friendly fighter within 6 inches plus 1 toughness. This is a substantial boost in survivability and makes it so even the strongest of enemies will struggle to reliably hit our units. The question becomes, is it worth taking the Signifier over just taking more dudes? Maybe. I think in this instance, the Signifier is very meta dependent. If you are struggling against Strength 5, Strength 6 enemies in your meta, the Signifier can really help with that. Issues start to arise when you spring this guy against lists that can't breach Strength 5 easily, as you aren't going to get much value at all. So look at your meta and take this guy accordingly. And now we get to the reason all of the above elite infantry don't get played in Iron Golems, the Armator, the short king himself. If you are looking at your screen, you should have immediately noticed why. The Armator is only 90 points. 90 points. For that, you are getting Toughness 5, Wounds 15, 4 Strength 4, 2-4 damage attacks. He is almost as powerful as a Signifier, but he comes at 35 points cheaper. The Armator has no unique abilities, and that's because he doesn't need any. The Armator is just a beastly unit through and through. In the grand scheme of Warcry, the Armator is one of the most price-effective models in the entire game. This guy can take a hit, and he can certainly dish it back in equal measure. The only downside to an Armator is his movement of 3, and this can be fixed with the likes of Rush, Blessings, or an ally, one of whom we will talk about later. The Armator represents a key way to play Iron Golems, and that is to spam Armators because they are such good value. So good, they invalidate most of your box. But not all of your box. If the Armator pushes a more aggressive form of play for the Iron Golems, then the humble Iron Legionary pushes towards control. Iron Legionaries are our most basic troop at only 75 points, but they too feel undercosted for what you get here. These guys are movement 4, toughness 5, and have 12 wounds. They are very chunky and even have okay damage to support that with 3 attacks at strength 3 and 1-4 damage. They aren't getting all that much done in combat, but with a critical of 4 and 3 attacks, you can certainly crit fish when you need to. Now, the main way to play these chaps is to use reactions though. Since they are fairly nippy, you can get them on objectives, clog up the works, and then react until they're dead. If you need to deal damage, then counter is the reaction for you. Opposing chaff will have a real hard time dealing with you thanks to your high toughness and high wounds, so counter away and force your opponent to take more damage for daring to raise their hands against you. If you want to live, then clashing iron is the way to go. Downgrading 2 crits is huge and prevents crit fishing from your opponent. Those 12 wounds and toughness 5 become very hard to shift when you are nerfing their damage every time they come to attack. You can take a warband full of these guys, and with the right support, you'll do absolutely fine. These are an incredible frontline infantry unit. But that's not all. There are multiple variants for the Iron Legionary. The bolus variant loses a point of toughness but gains a range 3 attack, which is very nice. Is it worth slashing your toughness for? Not really. Whilst there's probably a list waiting to be made that runs a lot of bolus and drill masters in conjunction with nets to really push that range 3, it's not one I think would be all that effective in the grand scheme. These are fine, but I would definitely say the shield variant takes precedent every single time. And you better believe there's more, although this is the last one. This is the Iron Legionary with twin hammers, and this guy is bad. You get +1 attack, but you lose out on that toughness 5. You may as well just take an armor turret at this point, since they are so much better value than twin hammer legionaries. And again, that toughness 5 is really hard to pass up. You are taking legionaries to be tanks. You don't want to reduce their bulk just so you can maybe deal 1 extra point of damage every now and then. It's a really bad trade. Overall though, the Iron Golems have a lot to like and a lot that just gets overlooked. The Dominar is solid enough, the Breacher, Armator and Basic Legionary are all excellent. Everything else in the middle, it's a little bit underwhelming by comparison. The more of the good stuff you can field, the better. But you aren't alone, you have access to some very powerful allies thanks to being part of the Chaos Grand Alliance. There are a lot of allies that work really well in Iron Golems, and one of my go-to allies in Chaos as a whole is the Trueblood. At 170 points, this guy is really good. He rocks a respectable defensive and offensive profile, whilst also sporting range 2 on his spear. This lets him hold his own in combat when he needs to, especially when you burn the Splintered Fang double to always hit on a 3+. Where he shines though, is in his ability to control the battlefield. He has the best net in all of Warcry, as it never misses. You spend a double, and an enemy fighter within 3 inches simply can't move or disengage. Super reliable and excellent at ensuring seriously threatening enemies don't get to play the game. Very, very handy. Now, the Shadow Piercer is an interesting pick that I don't think offers the same level of universal reliability as the Trueblood, but still has a place in the right list. The Shadow Piercer is fast at movement 5 and has a decent offensive and defensive profile for 170 points. The reason you bring him, however, is for his double, Harrying Raven. This lets you pick an enemy fighter within 20 inches and prevent them from disengaging. Why is this good? Well, since your Iron Legionaries are already looking to get into combat and clog things up, Harrying Raven just plays into that style by forcing key enemies to stay clogged up. Of course, it doesn't stop regular movement like a net does, but it also has 7 times the range, letting you cover almost the entire board, which is bonkers. It's riskier in some ways and more versatile in others, so experiment with both and see which one sticks for you. Continuing our trend of focusing on support pieces, Sloppity Barrel Piper is up next, and man, this guy is a bit of a steal at only 130 points. He has the defensive profile of a Shadow Piercer and Trueblood, but is noticeably worse on the offense. That isn't that big of a deal when you consider his unique double, Jolly Gut Pipes. In short, every friendly model that starts a movement action within 7 inches of the battle paper gets +1 movement. This is invaluable in an armor to heavy list as it basically removes their only weakness. Solid stats, a fantastic ability, and cheap in terms of points and resources. Perfect in the right list. Moving on from armor type buffing pieces, we go into a piece that loves to support Iron Legionnaires. The Shard Speaker, whilst very squishy with only toughness 3 and 18 wounds, is only 120 points and has a very powerful range attack and an ability that turns your tanky chaps into immovable walls of steel. Her triple is called Tendrils of Unnatural Smoke, and it reduces the attack characteristic of all enemy models within 6 inches of this fighter to a minimum of 1. This is devastating against just about everything. Going from 3 attacks to only 2 is catastrophic, and spoiler, a lot of big hitters in Warcry only have 3 attacks. The downside is that the ability is expensive, being a triple, but its power should not be underestimated when it's used to support a reaction control list. Let's move away from more passive support and let's move on to something more aggressive. The Slaughter Priest, specifically the variant with blood-bathed axe, rocks up with a pretty great stat line. We're talking 30 wounds, 3-5 on the damage profile, and a range of 2. Sure, he's 195 points, but even for just his stats, he's kind of okay. But we don't just take him for the stats. He has a great ability called Bloodbind, which lets you force an enemy within 8 inches of you to make a bonus move action directly towards you. This ability can't fail, it's cheap as it's only a double, and it's staggeringly powerful. Some basic plays you can make with this are, you can move enemies off of objectives, you can move enemies off of elevated positions. Following on from that, you can force enemies to jump off of platforms and potentially take fall damage or die. You can move buffing units out of range of their intended target. You can move units into engagement range of your other units. Heck, you can even move units out of an engagement range of your units so you can free up key models to move around without having to waste movement on a disengage action. The list goes on and on and on. This is an outstanding ability through and through, but you also have options. If you don't want to spend almost 200 points on a Slaughter Priest, you can instead ally in a Great Bray Shaman. This guy is 50 points cheaper, has the exact same ability, but is noticeably less resilient and does less in combat. He does, however, have +1 movement, making him more able to get into range to use his equivalent of Bloodbind, Devolve. I love the Mind Stealer Spheranx, and I said as much in my video covering this big cat a few months ago. Whilst not as killy as other Chaos allies like say the Thomride Crusher and Ogride Myrmidon, the Mind Stealer is still an excellent piece who can do a lot of work on the battlefield. Right off the bat, this thing is 260 points, making it by far the most expensive ally on this list. Secondly, its melee profile does leave a little bit to be desired with only 4 attacks, strength 5 at 2-5 damage. Other than that though, it's all positives. Movement 8 lets it get anywhere you need it to. Its oval base lets you contest multiple objectives at once. 30 wounds and toughness 5 ensures it sticks around when things get rough. You love to see all of that, but then we have its abilities and they are awesome. The 2 that stand out are Telepathic Threatening and Charm. Telepathic Threatening is a net through and through, however, instead of being tied to a measly 3 inches, it has a range equal to the ability dice value used. On a movement 8 body, that's an awful lot of threat range on your net, that's for sure. Now, since Iron Golems don't really have a quad worth using other than the generic Rampage, you are more likely to consider the Mind Stealer's quad, Charm. You pick an enemy within dice value range, that fighter then can't react or activate for the rest of the battle round. This is like a net but on steroids. You just pick someone and they are done. It doesn't matter how powerful they are, they just don't get a turn this round. It's crazy powerful. These two abilities alone sell the Mind Stealer. The stats, the body, the movement, and the base are all just icing. 260 points is very much a steal for this model. If you want to really push your offense, then look no further than a Varangard. We've specifically chosen the chap with Ensorcelled Weapon because it's pretty darn awesome. This guy has 30 wounds, toughness 6, and movement 10. He's not dying easily, and he can get wherever you want, whenever you want. Offensively, he's also pretty darn good too, with 4 attacks, strength 4, and 3/5 damage. Throw in his unique ability, Relentless Killers, to get a bonus 1 to 3 extra attacks on his next melee attack, and the Varangard becomes a proper little assassin. Throw him in, make a fuss, pick off units, the works. Just an all-round solid bloke. Now that we've looked at all of our available units and a good chunk of solid allies, let's build some lists to get you started on your journey. Now, some of these are more competitive than others, but they're all a blast to play. Now, this first one is pulled from overthinkingwarcry.com, which is in turn pulled from a recent 3-1 result over at Warhammer Fest. The power of this list comes from your 6 Iron Legionaries who can react the night away with Counter and Clashing Iron. You also have a lot of options thanks to your Slaughter Priest and Trueblood. You can pull enemies into your Wall of Iron to clog them up easier. You can pull them off objectives to ensure control, etc, etc. Your Trueblood gives you a guaranteed net, which lets you remove any enemy you want from the game. Both of these abilities are necessary in this list as you have very little kill potential. You need to make sure powerful enemies don't get the opportunity to mess with you, and if they do mess with you, you need to make sure it's on your terms. Really cool list with a lot of tactical nuance. Now, I dubbed this list the Pocket Prince Prance, and as the name implies, it's all about your armators. You have 5 short kings, and they will do a lot of heavy lifting thanks to their solid stats and low cost. The Sloppity Bile Pepper gives you a cheap +1 movement buff to everyone within 7 inches, letting you move deceptively fast for a warband with very little base movement. Armators will swing up with ease, but sometimes you need to make sure something dies. This is where your Breacher comes in. We have this guy with a +1 attack blessing, raising his already ludicrous damage to a whole new level. Throw him into anything troublesome and he should take it out without much hassle. Everyone can swing up, so get chopping. If you want even more killy, then boy do I have the list for you. I call this the Double Breacher Slam, and it runs 1 Dominar, 2 Ogre Breachers, 1 Armator, and 4 Iron Legionaries. Those 2 Ogres are the core of your list. That's 440 points of pure muscle, and you better believe they are hard to kill and can punch a hole through a dragon. This is actually an 8-man list, however, and we've packed it full of value. We have 1 Armator and 4 Iron Legionaries. This gives you a decent defensive force capable of taking and securing objectives, whilst your ogres make sure your opponents can't score because they are, well, they're dead. They died to the ogres. This isn't really a control list, so you are going to have to get more than a few kills to offset the activation advantage if you want to play and also win the objective game. But it's time to take a step back and go into something a little bit more defensive. This is my Legion list. It is 10 models strong, and it brings the following: 1 Dominar, 1 Shard Speaker, 1 Trueblood, and 7 Iron Legionnaires. Your whole shtick is getting on objectives and standing still. You have 7 Legionnaires to bolster your warband, and these guys aren't going anywhere once you start popping Clashing Iron. If you need even more help, the Shard Speaker can reduce all incoming attacks by 1, and the Trueblood can net anything that needs to stay away from your guys. This list has very little kill potential, but in an objective game, you are good to go. Easy to pilot, surprisingly fun, and pretty darn effective, all things considered. Not only that, you have 15 points left over, which is kinda spiced. We'd recommend giving the Dominar +1 strength or the Trueblood +1 movement. The strength gives you more leeway when it comes to leaning on your Dominar for kill duties, whereas the movement on the Trueblood allows you to get your net exactly where you need it to be. And that is all we have for the Iron Golems. I love these guys. They are just a rock solid faction who can be played in all kinds of ways. They are tough, strong, and love a good ally. They are perfect for newcomers as their playstyle is so straightforward and their models are just that reliable on the tabletop. One of, if not the best bespoke warbands right now. Go out and give them a go. But that is the end of this video. If you made it this far, thank you, you absolute legend. Please remember to support your ironclad toast by leaving a like, a comment, and a subscribe. Let me know down below if you think I was right here. Do you want to play Iron Golems? Do you play Iron Golems? Have I missed a trick? Let me know and help the greater Warcry community learn from my mistakes and your experiences. Until next time, lads, ladies, and everybody in between and beyond, I'll see you in the next video. Ta-ra.